Good evening. We've just got a few more melting pot classes left through the end of this month, so I'm glad that you're here tonight to participate in one of those three classes. If you're visiting with us, the classes we have offered here in the auditorium, Brother Wayne Kilpatrick has been doing a good job on the history of the church in Alabama, and Austin Oakley has been teaching a class through this door in the back corner classroom on From Peter to Petersville on 1st and 2nd Peter. And then downstairs in the fellowship hall, we have a singing class, teaching through singing. And we've been learning principles about singing, but the importance of singing in worship and enjoying what we do. And so those are three things that will be available to us in just a few minutes. John, you have an invitation song for us? 480. We're going to sing number 480 in just a moment. So if you'd like to, go ahead and take a songbook, open up to number 480. And we'll pray together, offer a devotional thought, and after the invitation, we'll have some announcements before we go to those classes. So if you would, as we get started together this evening, let's pause for a moment, let's bow our heads, and let's begin with a prayer to God. Heavenly Father, again, I'm so thankful for another opportunity that we have to come before you tonight, to be a part of this group of people who have made the decision to be here and to engage and encourage one another. I'm thankful for the chance that we have to sharpen each other through our study and through our time together. Thank you for this place that's been provided through the work of so many people, through their dedication, for our leaders now, and for our servants, for the hard work that they do to provide us with these opportunities to learn and to grow and to become better. As we have classes in just a few moments, I ask you to be with us and bless us through those, that our time together would be valuable, that we would be invested in them, and that you would do your work through us by our time together. Help us to be the kind of people that you want us to be. Help us to be that city set on a hill so that we can shine like stars in the universe. And thank you for forgiving us when we don't. It's in Jesus' name that we pray. Amen. I'd like for you to open up your Bible to Philippians chapter 4, one of my favorite verses in Scripture, Philippians chapter 4. It reminded me of a thought that I heard at Polishing the Pulpit back in August, and I had been looking for a time and an opportunity to share it in one of our devotional settings together. But Philippians chapter 4, of course, there's all kinds of good information in the book of Philippians, 4 short chapters. I think there's only 104 or 5 verses in the whole book, but there's an awful lot of good material that's found inside. And near the end of the book, we read in Philippians chapter 4, verse 8, "Finally, brothers, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is commendable, if there is any excellence, if there is anything worthy of praise, think about these things." Or dwell on these things. We are seeking something in our lives. We have what's called an ontological need in our life. Ontological is the truth of the matter. It's the information that we need to function correctly. And laid out through different philosophies and different discussions through the years, there have been 3 great ontological needs that we have. The first is the truth. We need to know what is true. And once we have found the truth, once we have been able to establish what is true, it leads us to the second ontological need, and that is what is good or goodness. You can't know if something is good or bad unless you know what is true and not true. So our first need is truth. Our second need is goodness. And then that leads to our third ontological need, which is beauty, which is an appreciation for the goodness that we see in the world around us. If you think about beauty in that way, beauty is when things are going according to the truth and following the path of goodness. We have 3 ontological needs: truth, which leads to goodness, which leads to beauty. But here's something that's interesting. In our lives, we seek 3 things psychologically. In other words, we are drawn to 3 great principles, and they go like this. In our lives, we spend time looking for things that are beautiful. We start there. We want to look and observe and find things in nature, in people, in other circumstances that are beautiful. We begin with that. And then beauty leads us to appreciate goodness, the goodness of things, which can then reveal the truth to us. We have these psychological needs to be beautiful, to seek beauty, to look for beautiful things in the world around us. But our beauty reveals goodness, and then goodness reveals truth, when in reality, it's kind of the other way around. What we need to be focused on is let's start with the truth, and then that will show us what is good. And then once we know what is good, we can use that to evaluate the beauty in the things that we see around us. When we go backwards, when we go the other way around, we're hit with all kinds of standards from society and from culture and from other people around us that try to influence the truth. That's one of the reasons the truth is so changeable today, is because we get to the truth last rather than starting with the truth and using it to define everything else for us. Philippians tells us that we need to find the things that are honorable and just and pure in our lives, that there are things that are lovely and commendable and excellent. And when we see these things that are praiseworthy, we need to praise them and we need to dwell on them. This coming week, you'll have a whole host of things you've got to get done. 3 things you will subconsciously be looking for are truth, goodness, and beauty. Can you put them in the right order as you look this week? And then secondly, can you put those things into the world around you through the actions that you make? That's my encouragement for you tonight. And if you need help to do any of those things, if you need help to find those good things in the world around us, we're going to sing an invitation song and offer you the chance to come forward and ask for help. If you'll do that right now, while we stand up and while we sing.
Up here. Quick question. Those that may be wanting to go on the history tour with Wayne giving us an idea of what the important places are in North Alabama, if you'd raise your hand if you can go this Saturday, let us get a count of how many people will be available to go this Saturday. They're starting about 9 o'clock in the morning. Wow. Okay.
Good to have everybody for our Sunday evening melting pot. Glad that you're here. If you're visiting with us, always glad to have visitors. I hope that you'll take part in one of the classes here as we're dismissed in just a minute. If you haven't had the opportunity to partake for the Lord's Supper, it is prepared for you. Go through the door to my right. Someone will be there to serve you. I want to remind you again of the holiday cheer at Glenwood. That's Tuesday night at 6 o'clock. We hope to have a good number there. We need young ones. We need middle-aged ones. We need seniors. We need anybody that can sing because it will wear you out after about an hour and a half. So we need a lot that can participate going up and down the hall singing Christmas carols. So hope to see you there on Tuesday night. If you haven't got your gifts here, please get those here by in the morning because those will be taken over there tomorrow or Tuesday morning. So please get those here. Lunch for the Underwood staff, Underwood Elementary. There's a sheet up here. We need some to bring soups, some to bring chili, some to bring sandwiches, and some desserts. If you'll help Lori Godey out on that, if you'll have those items here by 10 o'clock on Wednesday and sign this form. I'm going to put it up here as we're dismissed. Also, there's a sheet up there for the junior youth, 2-year-olds through 6th grade Christmas party. That'll be Friday, December the 21st at 6 p.m. in the basement. Bring $5 for your gift. Bring a $5 gift for your own child. So please sign that list also. And then if you can help with the hams for Underwood School, if you'll give that to Jim or Lori by next Sunday. The ladies' Christmas party at Donya Scott's, that's on Monday, December the 17th. There's also a list up front for that. I want to add one to our sick list, or one that's in the hospital. Ruby Hanback, I found out today, is in the hospital at the new North Alabama Regional Medical Center. It's going to take me a while to remember that. I'll be saying ECM for years to come. But she's in room 5217. Be sure and remember Sister Ruby and all the others that we have listed on the screen that's scrolling. Got a busy week. I hope that you'll take part in all the different things that are going on. Let's be dismissed at this time to go to our classes.
It's good to be with you this evening. We were talking about South and Central Alabama and how the Restoration Movement came into that last week. And I want to pick up there. I'd like to finish that this evening. And then the last 2 nights, I want to spend that on the North Alabama work, and especially the northwest part over here in this area. Chambers County, of course, that's one of the, it's south and east. And this Thomas Slaughter, we don't know much about him. He wrote this article, and I think this is the only thing that ever appeared in any of the journals written by him. I don't know if he was just a church member that was impressed by Brother Reeves and his work, but there was a fellow by the name of Prior Reeves. He had been minister amongst the Baptist churches over in the edge of Georgia. Then he came over into Chambers County, and he got in trouble with the Baptist associations because he was studying things and teaching things that was not in their manual. And, of course, that's the way you got in trouble with most of the denominational groups, by not following their manuals. And what he was doing is he was teaching from the Bible. Well, he began teaching some things that they accused him of teaching Campbellism. At the time, he didn't even know who Alexander Campbell was. And sort of like old brother John Smith, or John Taylor rather, here in West Alabama, he was accused of teaching Campbellism because he taught baptism for remission of sins, and in a debate that he was holding with a Baptist preacher down at, it was Frankfort, when Frankfort was the county seat of Franklin County. Brother John says, I don't know who Alexander Campbell is, but I got what I teach from Brother Peter in Acts chapter 2 and verse 38. And so the fellow, he couldn't say a whole lot more, because when John showed that to the people, quoted it, read it, and quoted it to them, they knew what he was talking about. And so Brother Reeves got in a similar situation. This is just a little short description, but I'm going to read this. It says, Brother Reeves has long been an intelligent and able minister among the Baptists. But a few weeks ago, he renounced everything but the unmixed Word of God, and is now proclaiming the gospel in its primitive purity, and is contending earnestly for the faith once delivered to the saints. A majority of all his churches go with him. The prospect for future seems to be flattering. 6 months ago, a teacher of the unmixed Word had never been heard of in this section of country. Now there are 2 churches and will be many. We want more light and more of the teaching and writings of the disciples. So this Thomas Slaughter was simply telling us how Brother Reeves came out of the Baptist church. Now this is Prior Reeves, and sometimes you'll see this in some of the reports he sent, because folks couldn't spell back then apparently. Sometimes it's Prior Reeves. But he's buried, if you go to Fort Deposit, just below Priester's Pecan Store, and turn left, go back east, you go 5 or 6 miles across country, and you run into another road that runs north and south. You turn back to the left and go up that road about 1.5 miles. There's a cemetery on the right, and that's where Brother Reeves is buried. But there's also 2 other gospel preachers buried there. This at one time was the very center of the church work in Montgomery County and Lowndes County. So that's the area, if any of you have ever been back in that direction. But he died just a few days and weeks before the Civil War ended. This is another one of the preachers that was very influential in that area. This man, his name is Alexander Graham. He was, and not Graham Bell, you know. I've often wondered if the Alexander Graham Bell was related to this man, because that's unusual that the inventor of the telephone has the name Alexander Graham Bell. But this brother Alexander Graham, he was born in Sumner County, Tennessee, up near Gallatin. As a matter of fact, it was east of Gallatin, about 3 or 4 miles just a little west of Hartsville, which is also in that area, that county. But he was born in 1811, and he moved down to, in 1836, he moved to Lowndes County and then over into Perry County. There's a town down there that's called Marion. Is there anybody in here that knows where Marion, Alabama is at? Any of you ever been there? Sir? Okay. Oh, yes, yeah. And there's also a big Baptist college, Judson, I believe, Judson College is there. Well, this man helped start one of those schools, the one that ended up as a military school. And so Brother Alexander Graham, though, before he left Tennessee, he moved away from Sumner County in 1836. He came down to this area, and he established a school, but he's also a gospel preacher. And so the work that developed in Perry County, a lot of it is owed to this man right here and the work that he did. So he supported himself by teaching, and then he preached on weekends and in the evenings. So he literally worked himself to death. He died in 1851. So if you subtract 1811 from 1851, he was about 40 years old when he died. And so he was very energetic as long as he was living. But this man here, a lot of the work in Perry and also in the western part of Lowndes County, Alabama, or Dallas County. I'm thinking about Selma, the county that Selma's in. And so Brother Graham, he taught a lot of people. He trained his nephew, who was P.B. Lawson, and Brother Lawson lived to be quite an old man and was very influential in that area. So it was just little pockets. It was not like it was here in the Tennessee Valley, where it all just sort of blended together. And we just had one collection of churches from Lauderdale County all the way back to Jackson County, north of the river, and then south of the river, Morgan, and then go on down south of Morgan to 2 or 3 counties deep to what's Coleman County now and Blount, but then come back across Fayette County and Colbert County and Franklin County and Marion County. So we had a big cluster here in the north part, but they didn't have that in the south. So it was very important, the works that these men did. This is informing us, this is an obituary of Brother Ishmael Davis. He was the first gospel preacher to ever preach, as far as we can tell, in the area of Montgomery itself and throughout Montgomery County. And then after him, his son, John V. or J.V. Davis, continued to preach, and he lived until the early 1870s. There's one little cemetery south of Montgomery. I believe that's 431 that comes down through Highland Home and goes down to Laverne. I always get 431 and 331 mixed up. But it's one of the 31s, those 3-digit 31s. But there's a little place down there called Prospect. And there's a cemetery there that has 9 gospel preachers buried in it. And the last one, the latest one that's buried in it, he died in the 1930s. Most of these men died before 1900. They were the pioneers in that area. If you've ever heard of the name Hilliard, Bartlett Hilliard is buried in that cemetery, and he was a gospel preacher back in the late 1830s. But John Davis, and I think Ishmael may be buried there with an unmarked grave, because he was preaching there for that congregation at the time he died. So this is Brother Ishmael Davis's obituary. And then here's another fella that got in trouble with the Baptist church down there. I think I mentioned him last week. His name was James A. Butler. And he was literally kicked out of the Baptist church for preaching what they call Campbellism. I read this to you last week, so we'll move on past that. But there are several things that was written. I would say that probably Brother Butler wrote more than 100 articles that was published in the various journals. Brother Campbell, Brother Stone, Brother Talbert Fanning, Brother John Howard up in Paris, Tennessee, and the Bible Advocate. All of these people were printing articles written by Brother Butler, so he was very popular. This is an article here that was written from Lowndes County, but it was written by a fellow by the name of William Mothershed. That's a very unusual name, and there's still people around Laverne that has this name, Mothershed. Brother Bill Bajan says he went to school with some Mothersheds. But this fellow also was one of the early preachers in that part of Alabama. Now, this is Brother P.B. Lawson's tombstone there in Marion. As a matter of fact, he's buried just across the road, literally, from that Judson Baptist College that we mentioned. And right by him is the gravestone of Brother Alexander Graham, his uncle. So these men, they were the success stories in that part of Alabama. And here's another report. He's talking, this is Brother Butler talking about how the church was growing in some places. But what was interesting here is the last paragraph. He says, our beloved John M. Barnes, or J.M. Barnes, poured the pathos of his soul upon the meeting. He was with others. He, with many others, was blessed in soul. He can begin to say to our sectarian neighbors, walk about Zion and go around her, number her towers, and mark ye well her bulwarks, and consider her palaces, that ye may tell it to the generations following. Yes, the permanency of the Zion's walls shall manifest her strength to all generations. Bless God. James A. Butler. Brother John Barnes had come out of South Carolina, and he too had been converted by just studying his Bible. Now, he trained to be a young Baptist preacher, but he didn't preach many sermons in the Baptist church because what he was reading and studying was not from the manuals, so they didn't let him preach much. And so he left and came to Chambers County, Alabama, and started a school to support himself and preach. But then he moved to Lowndes County, Alabama, started another school on a plantation down there that belonged to another old brother, and he supported himself in preaching, or supported himself in school, teaching school, so he could preach. And so he also made a big impact. Now, this is Alexander Campbell. As I've already said earlier in our series of lessons, Brother Campbell only set foot in Alabama 3 times, and all 3 times it was to raise money for his school, Bethany College. And so he didn't come to North Alabama, as a lot of our local legends say, because he left. I could show you the trips that he made, and he tells every day where he stopped, where he preached, who he stayed with, and not one single one of those people were from North Alabama. The nearest to North Alabama he ever got is when he came through Tuscaloosa, going west toward Meridian, Mississippi, and then up the east coast or east side of Mississippi to Columbus. So he was raising money, but he would preach. He raised money to build this building. The original building had burned, and Brother Campbell on his second trip was raising money to rebuild. So this is Bethany College, the way it looks. I took this picture just 3 or 4 years ago. Justice McDuffie Barnes, he's the man that started a school later at Highland Home. That's on that same highway down below Prospect going toward Laverne. And he started a school there. His 2 brother-in-laws, Samuel Jordan and M.F. Kirkpatrick, they all taught in that school and trained a lot of people, like Brother Larimore was doing up here in this part of the country. They were training preachers in the south part. And that's when the Restoration Movement really got on a fast pace in South Alabama, and when the school started. Now, he was graduated in 1858 from Bethany College, and he came home and started this school. So he started that school earlier than Larimore, but the school where he first located it didn't do all that well. So in 1881, he moves the school down to Highland Home, and there is where him and these other teachers made a name for themselves as being some of the best teachers in the state of Alabama. The school continued till 1916. About 1921 or 22, they gave that property to the county, and it became a county school. And so there's still a school on the site of where the old Highland Home School was located. The school was taught by Brother Barnes and Jordan and his both brother-in-laws, and Kirkpatrick was one of them. You may remember in some of our songbooks, there's a Kirkpatrick that is written either music or words to several of our songs as you look through our songbook. That was a grandson of this man here. Both of these men, as I've said, were his brother-in-laws. This is Brother Barnes. By the way, he holds the I guess, the claim to being one of the first automobile fatalities in the United States. He bought a Ford, the kind that you guide with a stick, before they invented the steering wheel. And he was driving from Montgomery home one day, back down to Highland home, and he saw a friend out in the field, and he waved at him, and apparently knocked that stick a little too quick or something. He ran off in a deep ditch. The car turned over and broke his neck, and he died there. This was about 1911 or 1912. So he was a very early fatality in the automobile accidents. But this man was one of the most powerful men in the South as far as a gospel preacher. He's buried in that huge cemetery. I can never remember the name, right there in Montgomery. It's the same cemetery that George Wallace and a bunch of the governors are buried. And so Brother Barnes was living in Montgomery, but he was going back and forth and checking on the school at the time. Okay, so this is the historical marker at the old Highland Home College site. And this is that's part of the school building, the high school building that's located there. And this is a plaque in that cemetery that I mentioned earlier, there at Prospect. So there's a bunch of preachers buried there. And this is Brother J.M. Barnes' father and mother's grave. Lucy was probably the first woman baptized by the first preacher that came into the Montgomery area. She was baptized by Brother Ishmael Davis. And this would have been about 1826, and that's when he came into the area. So the Barnes family were one of the few that had an early connection to our restoration movement in that area. But you can see this is Miss Mary and her husband Elkanah, that's J.M. Barnes, and his name is Justice McDuffie. Now that other J.M. Barnes I mentioned earlier, his name was John McAfee Barnes. Two different people. They were not related at all. Brother J.M., the one I'm talking about now, made a mention one time, I would not be ashamed to call the other man my relative, because the other man did a lot of work for the Lord's kingdom too. So two different Barnes, but it's interesting. They were in the same area, different generations, had the same initials. And this is a little monument tribute there in the Prospect Cemetery to Brother J.M. Barnes. I said 1911. It was 1913, according to this stone, that he died. And then there's another doctor that or another preacher that came along, was old Brother David Adams. And he too had come out. He'd trained to be a Methodist minister back over in Georgia. And as he was studying, he became very discouraged trying to study that discipline that they use. And so he had basically tossed that thing away and was just studying his Bible. But he had trained to be a doctor. He had trained under his uncle. He had studied up in Philadelphia in that medical school, which was one of the leading medical schools at the University of Pennsylvania. And Brother Adams' uncle was one of the best teachers in that school. So he had a good education in the medical field. So he wanted to move over into Alabama, came out of Georgia, moved over into Alabama, and began practicing medicine. He moved to Wilcox County. Any of you familiar with Wilcox County? It's probably the poorest county in the state of Alabama. And it's right down in what they call the Black Belt. And it's a small county. And Pineapple, I think, is the county seat to Wilcox County. And Pineapple's not much bigger than Leeton, Alabama. But Dr. Adams had a medical practice there, had his own hospital, had 8 beds in a hospital built right down the hill from his house. And that's the way he supported himself. But how he got to where he was at in the church is interesting. He came into this area, and he found some folks that were disgruntled with the Baptist manual that they were using. And they had basically tossed it aside, and they were studying. Well, they had heard this doctor talk about some of his experiences trying to find the truth, and they all asked him if he would come and study with them and teach them. Well, he did, and they established the Church of Christ there in Pineapple, Alabama. Now, if you're not familiar with that part of the country, when you go south from Fort Deposit down Interstate 65, the next town of any size is Greenville. That's in Butler County. And you can get off the interstate there and go west and just keep traveling west, and you'll come into Wilcox County, about 25 or 30 miles over there. But this Dr. Adams, he was one of the clearest speakers from that part of the country. This is a picture of Brother Adams and his wife. And my wife and I were privileged to go in this house right here. The old gentleman that owns it, he overheard me say to my wife, we had gone down to see the cemetery, a family cemetery, right there over the hedge from this house. And this old gentleman was out in the yard, and he overheard me say to my wife, I wonder if the people that live here know that this old fellow was a gospel preacher. And the old fellow over on the other side, he says, yes, we know that. He said, would y'all like to come over and look through the house? Well, that's like saying sick 'em to a dog when you're talking to a history teacher. And so we got to go through this house and through the old hospital that sits down at the foot of the hill. But Dr. Adams was wealthy because he was a doctor. This is where we were at. We were chalking that monument when the old gentleman overheard us on the other side of the hedge. But he was a very strong contributing factor to how strong the church was around Fort Deposit and back toward Montgomery on the west side of the interstate. So there was a lot of these folks that were just absolutely great in the Restoration movement. Now, this is a little thing that Brother David Adams was writing about his conversion, but he also mentions several others in here. He mentions J.M. Barnes, who was that John Barnes I've talked about, and then later he mentions the other J.M. Barnes, Brother Justice McDuffie. So he was friends with all of these people, and he lived to be quite an old person. And this fellow right here, I don't know, there was a time when in our country, especially with the men, the male children, the parents gave them 3 given names. And this is S.I.S. Cawthon, and he has 2 sons buried there near him, and they have 3-digit given names. And I've encountered that from this time period, about when they would have been born and named. I found others in a different part of the South with 3 names. Sometimes it's hard for me to write out with just 2 given names. When you write out Charlie Wayne Kilpatrick several times on traveler's checks or something, it gets about that long and your hand starts getting tired. But this was Samuel, Isaiah, and I don't know what the S stood for. But this brother right here, he came into Andalusia, Alabama, when it was a logging town. When they were cutting the timber, there was a lot of pine trees in that area that hadn't been cut. And he came in with that. He was also a doctor, but he was a great gospel preacher. And this man is one that started a lot of those churches in western Florida, just below the Alabama line, in the western panhandle, from Pensacola back toward where the Florida line runs into Alabama. So as a matter of fact, Brother Cawthon died while on one of those preaching tours in the northwestern part of Florida, and they brought his remains back to Andalusia. But see, he died the same year that Brother J.M. Barnes from Highland Homes died. But some of these names I know, and this is a story that was written, a biographical sketch that was written by Brother W.T. Grider, who also was a gospel preacher and worked at Alabama Christian School or Christian College there in Montgomery when it was first established. And then this is Brother Thomas Golson. This is the one I was talking about. His wife is the last of the preacher families that was buried there at Prospect. And I don't know if any of you ever knew Brother Earl Kimbrough. Did anybody ever know Earl Kimbrough? He grew up at Russellville. He preached when the division came in the church, over the orphan home and the schools. Brother Earl went with the non-institutional brethren. But he has become a good friend of mine through the years. He has softened his attitude toward those who didn't go that way. He has really changed. And he says, I just wish we could all get back together. And but Brother Earl's wife was Brother Golson's daughter. And so that's how I knew that Brother Golson was buried there. Earl was the one that told me. I didn't know Thomas Golson from anybody else. But that's how I got Thomas Jefferson Golson. So all of these sketches were written by Brother Grider about the preachers in that part of the area. Now this is a little thing where they're asking people, and I believe Brother Cawthon is the one that wrote this, where they're asking people to come down and do mission work in that area. They're saying that if you'll come down, we'll give you a horse and we'll furnish you a place to live, and then we'll give you $200 or $300 a year. That was a pretty good bit of money back then to come and preach in this area. And they were trying to get some of the young men coming out of the Nashville Bible College or Bible School and some others into this area. Brother G.W. Neely, I put him in here because he really messed things up in the South. He came from the North after the Civil War was over, and he got into politics. And he got a lot of the black folk down there in Lowndes County and some of those counties siding with him, and he could get elected for almost anything after the Civil War. And he began to, it was almost like he was going to destroy the white church. And so Brother Neely was not very popular. Before the Civil War, before all of this started, he was a good preacher in that area. But the Civil War spoiled him and nearly spoiled the church under his influence. So we have to be careful. Brother David Adams had just written that I showed you, and he's the one from Pineapple. As a matter of fact, you'll see it's got his address there, Pineapple, Alabama. I don't know why that's showing up twice. And then here's another interesting fella, Brother George White. He also came out of Georgia, and he too had been connected with the Baptists, but a different branch of the Baptists. The Baptists, between 1825 and 1835, had a division. And it happened in Middle Tennessee, it happened right here in North Alabama, and it happened over in Georgia. Well, there was some breaking away from that old Calvinistic teaching of once saved, always saved, impossibility, falling from grace, and all of this, original sin. They were breaking away from that, and they were called free will. And Cyrus White is the man who started that group. Well, this man was a cousin to Cyrus White, and he too pulled out of the churches that were teaching once saved, always saved. They began to teach God has given us a brain, and he gave us enough sense with his word that we can choose whether to serve him or not. That if we're lost, it's because we made the choice to be lost. If we want to be saved, we can be saved by obeying him and trying, to do his will. And that's what Cyrus White and those Free Will Baptists began to teach. And at this point, there were none of them using instrumental music in worship. The only thing that held them different from our brethren was they hadn't discovered yet that you need to be baptized for remission of sins. But then when Cyrus White over in Georgia finally figured that out and started preaching it, they were outnumbered. And so most of the free will Baptists moved over into eastern part of Alabama. Well, this man right here, George White, was one of those. He was born in Henry County, Georgia, September the 15th, 1800. Fell asleep at his residence in Crenshaw County, Alabama, September the 2nd, 1891. Brother White came to within 13 days of his 91st birthday. He had passed beyond his 80. Elder George White was buried with Christ by W.H. McGahey. That's Brother William McGoy, the man who came over into Montgomery and was preaching. I mentioned him last week. Him and Brother Davis. Davis was first and then McGoy. Now, it's misspelled here. It's actually spelled capital M, little c, capital Gauhey. That's the way the name is supposed to be spelled. But somebody spelled it this way. But this is the man who came into Montgomery. So you see, Brother White was baptized by the same man that brought the message into Montgomery area in 1826. It says, and as far as the writer hath knowledge, hath lived consistent with his profession. Obviously, this was an obituary, and it was taken from, I believe, the Millennial Harbinger. We'll get to that next. He then entered the kingdom of Christ, honored his great head by wearing only such names as it pleased the king to apply to his subjects, and was ever careful to hearken to the will of the master, which said, if any man speak, let him speak as the oracles of God. His last days were spent near Clear Spring Church, Crenshaw County. There's a little place down there. If you bat an eye, literally, you've passed it. It's called Seawright, Seaaright. And I don't know how it got that name. There might have been some people by that name. I don't know. But it's a little community. There's only one little convenience store there now. Most of the houses sit off of the road that you travel now. There's an older road, and they sit behind the trees over there, so you go right through and you don't even know you're there. And says, and his seat was never vacant on the Lord's day if he could control the circumstances. This is Brother White. And this is his tombstone. I went down 3 or 4 years ago and found it. And this man spent a lot of time in that area in Crenshaw County preaching. And then his sons. But he also had a friend, John Knoll, who came out of Georgia at the same time, part of the same group. And Knoll is buried about 8 or 10 miles across a lake down there now, on the other side of the lake from where Brother White is buried. That lake wasn't there when they came there, of course. But it says, on the 9th day of September 1837, this is how they organized. The house of Wiley Bowling, Henry County, Georgia, the following named persons who then agreed to meet every Lord's Day when in their power at some convenient place in the neighborhood for the purpose of worshiping God: Samuel Smith, Isom Hicks. Now, Isom Hicks was also another gospel preacher that came into the Montgomery area. William Taylor, John Knoll, George White, Thomas Baker, Perry Hicks, Susan West, Nicey White, that was George's wife, Delilah Knoll, that's supposed to be Knoll. It says Nail, but it's supposed to be Knoll, and Lavinia Taylor. Those people all came together and organized a church back in Georgia, and this is the church that moved into Crenshaw County. So you see what I'm trying to, and this is George White's 2 sons and their wives in front of the old church building there at Seawright. But what I'm trying to get us to see, brothers and sisters, that a lot of these people, they didn't have a lot of gospel preaching like we were exposed to in our lifetime, because this was a new frontier. The Baptists, the Methodists, and the Presbyterians, they were the dominant religions on the frontier. And we're talking about, it was still frontier times in that part of Alabama. There were still some Creek Indians running around and harassing the people, and maybe every once in a while somebody would be killed by them. But these people went through turmoil back in Georgia in order to worship God by following the Bible and not the creed books. Same thing happened right here in North Alabama to an extent. So when I look at these people and see the sacrifices they made in order to get the church where it is at, I think truly we are standing on the shoulders of giants. Are there any questions? I've gone through this. Apparently, seems like I've gone through this fairly quick. Didn't mean to shortchange you. Yes, sir. Okay. If you can locate Wheeling, West Virginia, there's an interstate that comes out of Indianapolis, Indiana, and it keeps going across Ohio, all the way across Ohio. You cross the Ohio River at Wheeling. And if you keep going, you go just right over into the southwest corner of Pennsylvania. I think I can show you on a map right here. Let me just but man, I've got a PowerPoint for everything. It won't take me but a second here if I can get to this to show you. Okay, let's go to Restoration Movement. And let's see here, West Virginia. Well, I thought I had a map there. But there's a little slither of West Virginia that's squeezed in between the southwestern corner of Pennsylvania and the Ohio River. Well, both of those are running at an angle. And so eventually you go about 30, maybe 40 miles at most from Wheeling north, and it runs, it finally, the river and Pennsylvania cut it off. But in that strip of land, that's called the northern neck of Virginia. And about halfway from Wheeling to the north of that thing is a little town called Wellsburg, West Virginia. It sits right on the Ohio River. And you can turn east there and go over and under some mountains or hills. They call them mountains. They're just big old hills to me. And about 8 or 10 miles traveling east, you'll come into a little village of Bethany, West Virginia. And it's about halfway between the Ohio River and the Pennsylvania line. You keep going east from Bethany, you'll run right into Pennsylvania. But it's really sitting in an out-of-the-way place. There's only 2 roads that go into it. And, of course, one travels through it, but there's another one comes from the south, comes right out of Wheeling on the east side and goes to it. But this it's a little valley, and the college probably doesn't have more than 1,500 students. They don't have a lot of students. It's not a big college at all. But Alexander Campbell would roll over in his grave if he knew what was going on there now. They only require one Bible class for the 4 years that a student is there. It was written in the charter that students must study the Bible at Bethany. Well, Campbell meant they must, every semester, they're supposed to take a Bible class. And that's the way it was until he died, and then the next president after him. But somewhere in the 1930s, somebody got the wise idea, if they only take one class, that still answers what the charter said. And so that's where it is at now. But they sell liquor. There's 2 stores. And the students can go down the hill and they can buy Jim Beam all of those different kinds of whiskey that's made, they can buy it right there on campus. Alexander Campbell, if it was possible, he'd be rolling over in his grave if he knew that, because he would have never allowed it. But the college is so liberal now that if you want to ruin your son or daughters, send them to Bethany. It's not even, shouldn't even be called a Bible college anymore, because it's everything but that. But it's a sad thing, because Brother Campbell raised all that money, spent a lot of time and energy, and then he taught until he died in 1866. So to me, it's sad when I think about what has happened at Bethany College. By the way, this right here, this is an old drawing that came out of a little, I've got the book that was printed in 1868. It was like an annual, had the picture of each student and had their name under it, and that's all that was in the little annual. But this was a pen and ink drawing of that school in 1867. Hasn't changed a lot. Thank you for allowing me to come and